Hello, friends. Welcome. It is week 3, lecture 3. So we are finishing up our week here. Um, this week has been unique. It hasn't been too much new information. We had talked about map and filter, higher order functions, callback functions, started to work through some of that. Yesterday, we talked about lifting state and use effect. We're going to do more of a recap here in just a second. And then today, we're going to introduce APIs and Axios. Now, what I kind of want to do is I'm going to talk about sort of more theory of APIs and Axios. I'm going to introduce a tool that you guys can download and use. That way we can kind of see what an API gives us and how that works, that we're going to be using in the future anyway. It's called Postman. So I'm actually going to introduce this now. Just so you know, I'm not hoping to get through everything about APIs today. And the reason is because all next week is really when the API stuff is coming in, right? That's really where your assignments are going. So we will hit APIs a little bit harder on Monday. React Router is a simple kind of idea there. So we can continue to hit APIs as well. So we are going to hit some APIs today. I've said the word API way too many times now, but we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the theory, what an API is, how it works. We're going to use Axios and see sort of a request. And, if we make a request, if it's good, what happens? If it's bad, what happens? And really, we're just going to mess with an API call first and foremost. Next week, that's when we'll talk about promises and really get into our thens and catches and really looking at Axios. So we're just going to introduce the information today. And then next week, we're really going to dive into kind of the anatomy of not a URL, but of an API. Also, we will be dealing with React Router. We have some really kind of malleable next couple weeks. I usually like to introduce MongoDB. This is kind of a catch-all class because really similar to APIs, MongoDB stuff is not until this next week, but I try to give you as many days as possible. In this case, it's 4 days that are currently scheduled for us to do a full stack build. We're going to build something from the back end all the way to the front end and everything in between. That's going to look very, very similar to how the exam looks. So we don't really need 4 days. That's kind of overkill. I go real slow. We could do 3 days and it would be just fine. So just so you know, if we don't get super far with APIs today, then what we can do is we can kind of push this next week and then deal with Mongoose. Mongoose and MongoDB are not hard concepts, especially with this CRUD application. It's not hard at all because Mongoose handles everything for us. So with that being said, let's go ahead and let's jump in. You've got a couple of housekeeping things. We've got some discussion questions due Sunday. I say that every time. And then we've got our core assignment that is to-do list. Now, don't sleep on that assignment. It's a challenging one. Gray kind of gave you a really important piece today where you are passing in some information so that way you can identify which piece of state we are working with. So if we are dealing with, a completion, how do we know which one, if I click it, which one was just clicked, right? And that's based off of this identifier. I do recognize that this is a challenging assignment because normally you're not manipulating state in kind of inline, right? You would manipulate a database and get some information from that. Then you would have some sort of state would basically be rerun or reassigned. We're not doing that because we don't have a database yet. So just know if this whole idea of grabbing a piece of state in one particular piece of state and let's update it, if that's a challenging thing, we're not going to be doing that once we introduce a database. That is an antiquated idea. That's not something you will do in the real world anyway. You're going to be dealing with database calls and API calls. So just so you know, if to-do list turns out to be a doozy, which oftentimes it does turn out to be a doozy, that's okay. And some of the stuff is good to know, and it's great problem solving and getting you thinking about code and thinking about how to work it and thinking about how to kind of problem solve. But if you don't know how to do it without watching the video, that's also very okay because it is a challenging assignment. Cool. Any questions on our housekeeping stuff? Let me open up the chat. Yeah, it is tough, Christian. It's a tough one. Yeah, just like Paul said, it has the minute we introduce a database, you would sit and say like, oh, this is way easier, right? Because we'll have identifiers and we'll be able to identify things much, much easier instead of kind of having to rework it in a weird way. Cool. All right. Just a little bit of a recap. We talked about state and this idea of lifting state. Can anybody tell me why would we want state to be lifted? What is the whole point of lifting state, of us grabbing state, of manipulating state? What is the point of that?
To be able to access the data for your siblings.
Yeah. Okay, siblings, Tony, you said that. Somebody else was talking, whoever else was talking. Why did we talk about this idea of siblings? What is this about? They hate talking to each other, as Christian says in the chat. That's funny. Siblings hate talking to each other, but what do we need to do? We are lifting state to a parent because a component cannot, if it's a sibling with another component, it can't share state, right? What it does is it has to be up in the parent, and then from the parent, it can come down, and then we can manipulate any sort of state there. And so this idea of lifting state is giving us access to things. If multiple components need access to the same state, we can then manipulate it that way. Does anybody remember if I have a piece of state in my parent, in this case, we had it in our app.js, and I wanted to pass it into a piece of a component, sorry, how would I do that?
You call on it. You call on your state through like on your app.js. You do the form and then you call on your state.
Yeah, exactly.
Or using props, I guess that's maybe what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for here. So let me actually bring up that code. Yeah, exactly, Philip. We are calling on our state. Yes, we're calling on it, and the way we're passing it in is through props, right? It is through props. Now, there's a piece of information that's kind of important and really important when we're calling and passing this into props. Which one of these? I mean, they're both important. So obviously, if you're like, oh, both of these, that's obviously true. But between these guys right here, I don't know why my computer's taking forever. Between this and this, which one is really important when we get to the component for us to know? Is it this part or this part, and why? So if I've got my movie form, these are both the same. But if I were to change this to unicorn, and I were to deal with my movie form, which one refers to my piece of information? Is it all movies, like in my form? Am I going to call all movies right here? Or am I going to call unicorn?
You would have to call it unicorn if you call it unicorn in your app.js.
Yeah, why is that? We want to call this unicorn.
Because that app.js is passing down state.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Billy. Because
Billy.
app.js is passing this piece of information down, remember, this is us basically creating a variable or saying, hey, I want to give my movie form this piece of information called all movies, right? Which is our state here. But we're saying, I'm going to pass this and say, hey, here is unicorn. Its value is all the movies. But movie form is going to get it and it's going to be like unicorn, right? And it's going to know this is all of this information. And so just reminding you that this piece on the right, because this is oftentimes where students get confused, this is just what is the value of this? And in this case, it's referring to our state. This guy right here on the left is what we have to, when we're dealing with props, that's going to be what we pass over, right? So if I call this all movies, or I will only call this all movies if, when this is being passed down, this is also called all movies. And it is case sensitive. So if I had this as like all movies, this is not the same as this. And I do see this oftentimes with students where they'll You can't just switch because remember, computers are just ones and zeros, right? And we talked way back in the kind of beginning that each letter, just within a computer, each letter has a number associated, right? And so all movies with a capital A is a different number than all movies with a lowercase a. They are different when it comes to binary, and remembering that computers only know binary makes it really, really, really important to know. Great job. Cool. Now we can also pass down our functions, like our setters here, or if I just had some sort of function, like if I had like a constant change, and I said change all movies. If I had this, I could do this, right? I could pass in. This is just a GitHub Copilot made this, but I could pass in just any sort of function in the same way I passed in all movies. It would do the same thing. So then in my actual component itself, I just call that function just like I normally would, and it'll run that functionality. So just know that it's not only state that you can pass down. It is not just state that you can pass down. You can also pass down functions as well. So if you wanted to do that, you totally could. Cool. Delete that so that way we don't get confused on what the heck that is if during the exam you guys are panicking and looking through this code. Okay, so we've talked about our lifted state. That's awesome. Now we also talked about another hook called use effect. Anybody tell me just from a high level, what does use effect do? Why is it important?
It runs on render and when something changes.
It can, right? Does it always run on render? Does it always, what else was it called? I said a specific word when a component is read, there's a term for it. Does anybody remember what that is?
I meant just like the initial render, but I'm failing to think of the term you're thinking of.
So it's called mounting, right? When the component is mounted, right? When it's first read and added onto the DOM, then all of a sudden it can be ran. Now, just want to reiterate something because this is also something that students kind of get confused. Use effect is usually use state. I think people kind of are like, oh yeah, I kind of get that. Use effect can be iffy. One thing to note is we have two pieces of use effect here. This is called what? Does anybody remember? What's the second portion or second argument?
Dependency.
Yeah, it's right there, right? This guy right here. It's our dependency array. Now, when our component is mounted, if this is empty, this means that once it's mounted, it runs, and then that's the only time it runs, right? When the component's mounted, that's it. It's never going to rerun. Again, use effect is a way that we can have code that we want to run over and over and over again based off of some sort of condition. Now, if it's just an empty array, then it's only when the component is first mounted, and that's it. Now, we don't have to have it run when it's first mounted. We can put some sort of condition or some sort of value within my dependency array. And only once this is changed and or affected, right, then it runs this code again. And so we saw that if I were to spin this up, then what would happen is I had this button, right, that I could click. And once it was clicked, what I could do is, once it's clicked and it's run this set count, this value changes because it takes our original count, adds 1, changes the value. And once this is changed, this is always listening and it says, okay, this was changed. Now let's go run this code. And we saw that we could do this add count. What is our big no-no of what to do within use effect, and why is it a no-no? It happened yesterday and I panicked a little bit.
Don't put your dependency inside the function there.
Don't set
Yeah.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah, don't put your setter in here. So if I had set count, right? Set count, and I said count plus 1, we saw that once this happened, I just had this infinite loop. Anybody remember why, the explanation of why we can't have that, what was happening?
It won't stop.
Yeah.
Like, doesn't
For
it
example-
basically run like a for loop and then it just never stops?
Well, the
Yeah.
count is triggering count.
Yeah, exactly, right? So use effect only runs when count is changed. So then let's say we clicked on a button, count changes, right? So then it runs this code. And so it's saying, cool, I need to finish this code. But then we're console logging, great, everything is perfect. And then we run set count again. So then obviously count changes. So then when count changes, what happens? It runs this code. And so because we're changing our count within the code that's run when the count is changed, it can never stop, right? It can never, ever, ever stop. So we want to be cautious. And if your computer ever panics like mine did, like begging for its life, then we know that it's because this count, or we might have had a setter within, based off of our dependency, based off of what's in our dependency array. A setter could also be in there, and then now we have an infinite loop, right? Because there's no way for it to get out of this loop, for it to handle that, right? Because every time count changes, it runs it, but then in that it changes, so then it just goes on to the stack and it keeps going and going and going and going and going forever. Cool. Now we're gonna use effect on Monday. I don't know that, maybe we'll do it today, just to kind of show you some stuff, but that is kind of what we've talked about. That was our recap of what we talked about yesterday. Are there any questions? This is a week that is purposefully not super heavy. That's why you only have one assignment, though it's a challenging assignment. It's not a super heaviest week because honestly, this is when students start to be like, oh man, there's a lot going on here. So I want to make sure that there's no questions of everything we've learned up to now. No questions before I go on to our next sort of piece of information. Any questions? You guys are good. Put a 1 in the chat if you are perfect up to now. A 0 if you're not. Okay, lots of 1s. Great. We love to see 1s or 0.8s or anything. Just any sort of response from you guys, I'll take. And if you guys are feeling like, I just need to get my feet wet a little bit more, that's okay. That's very common. That's very normal. Cool. Great. Can anybody tell me, we're going to look at the platform here in a second. I'm going to move some stuff around. But can anybody tell me what an API is? Today we're talking about APIs. We're going to talk about APIs. Can anybody tell me what an API is?
Basically just like kind of raw information from the source on the internet, or like they package raw information for you to implement into your code, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, can Tabitha, if you can mute, thank you. Yeah, no, exactly. I think that was Cameron.
Yep.
It is a way that we can ping, or you might hear it being called like ping an API or calling an API, but it's a way that we can grab some sort of information from another source. API really stands for Application Programming Interface. So really it is somebody's got a tool that you can call into, and maybe it gives you some piece of information back, right? You make what we call a request, and it gives you what we call a response, right? I tried to use this analogy last stack, and Gray can attest. I fumbled through it, but I'm going to go ahead and try again. And hopefully we can, Cameron, no Yana here. You're going to get me, dude. You're going to kill me here. Hopefully this time it makes it a little bit better. But let's pretend that we are humans. We are, maybe, but not AI yet, though our overlords are wanting to, and or Elon Musk is going to make us half of it. Okay, let's pretend this is us, right? And we are at a restaurant. Cool. We're at some fine dining restaurant. And let's say we've got, here is going to be our kitchen. I'm gonna label this Cool. And then this is going to be human. Us. Okay. Now, whenever you go to a restaurant, what do you normally do? How does a restaurant work? I know from a very basic, I know this is kind of a basic question, but how does a restaurant work? You go and you sit down, not the ones that are like, not like a Chick-fil-A or a McDonald's or anything, but you go to an actual restaurant and it's like a sit down restaurant. What happened? What goes on?
The
You chat for a
ability
bit and then you order food.
sit you
Yeah, you
down.
sit down.
They give you the menu.
You got, yeah. So you read and say, what are some available options for me? Right. So I'm just gonna right here. So like we sit down, we read a menu or do a QR code because now of COVID. And then what happens? We sit down and we read a menu. Then what happens? Tabitha, I think you said something. How do we get our food?
I
What do
was
we
just
do?
saying that you sit down, you wait and you talk and then you just order.
Yeah, we talk. Who do we talk to?
Typically our company. I mean, unless you're an Instagram
Yeah.
person.
Right. So we talk to like a waiter, right? Or / server. And then they take our order. And then you'll be able to see this here in a second because I don't think until I like click out, then it gets that. Then we wait for a second. So then we wait and then we get what we requested. Right? This is how it totally works. This is how it typically works. The same sort of concept and idea. Can you guys hear me, by the way? I don't know if my AirPods are going out or if I just couldn't hear Tabitha.
Yep. Sound good.
Okay.
We're good.
Okay. Oh, just one AirPod. Hold on. We're not doing an AirPod. Okay, can you guys still hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. We'll just do this. Okay, so same sort of idea, same sort of concept happens when we're dealing with an API, right? We as humans, as developers, as entities, go somewhere, whether it's a website or prepared or know sort of where we want to go or where we're going to call sort of the address, if you will. And then we make some sort of request, right? So we're going to make a request. Oh, that's terrible. I should do that. 2, and it's kind of nice because it kind of matches the same thing. So we make our request. I'm going to call this our request. And then it is to our server, right? And this is like from a computer perspective, then it's to our server. Cool. Now our server is going to take that request. They're going to take our order and they're going to go to the kitchen. And they're going to say, hey, my user has got this request. Right? And so they're going to take our request to the kitchen. They want to have a quesadilla. Cool. Great. The kitchen does what the kitchen does. It goes, it gets the ingredients, and it says, okay, here's my tortilla, here's my cheese, here's my chicken, here's my peppers. Then once it's done, right, what it then does is it gives us back our quesadilla, right? And it gives us we get to consume this quesadilla. We sit down, we eat it, we laugh, we have fun. Best night of our life. And so we make this request, and our kitchen gives us back, and in technology, we call this our response. So it's like a request response cycle. You might have learned that idea or that concept or that name in the web fundamentals section, right? So where we make this request and then the kitchen gives us a response. Now, sometimes, let's say, I've never worked in a restaurant, so if this isn't how it works, I'm sorry. But let's say our kitchen, the server is just going to go back and forth and they're just going to say, hey, they're going to put into their little machine and say, this is what the user, the human wants, right? But the kitchen's just for food. Now, let's say that there is also, and we'll see kind of how this all plays apart here in a second, that we also have our bar, right? Let's say we ordered a cocktail.
Cause it's Friday night and we just want to let our hair down, you know? Bar. Okay. Well, if that's the case, the kitchen doesn't have what we need, right? But it knows where to get it. So then the kitchen goes and it takes our request to the bar. Right? Let me call this request. Then the bar goes and it makes our overpriced cocktail or mocktail if you're into that sort of thing. Which I had my first mocktail the other day and honestly it hit pretty hard. And then we go and it says, okay, cool, here you go. And it gives us the response. Perfect. And back to the kitchen, and the kitchen goes and it gives us our response back, and then it eventually or gives it to our server, and our server brings it to us, right? This is how a normal from a high level, this is how a normal restaurant operates. An API works the same sort of way, right? Where if instead of having this as like servers and kitchens, we're gonna have this as our, let me do this. So our server is going to be like our API, right? Where we make some sort of request to it. Let me kind of select that, move it a little bit. We're going to make some sort of request to it. And then it's going to make a request and or see, can I fulfill? Do I have the things I need in order to fulfill this request? Oftentimes, the real things is like, we're going to have some sort of framework that the API is going to say, cool, did you ask in a specific way? Like, did we call it if a meal instead of a quesadilla is called, you know, upside down burger. I don't know. I just made that up, right? Then if we call it that specific name, then it's like, cool, I can fulfill that, right? So it might have some rules, or it might have to go to, anybody think what our bar could be in this tech idea? What would our bar typically be?
Is
Think of-
that the database?
Yeah, exactly. Great job. Database, right? It says, do I have the criteria needed? Do I already have this? Or do I need to go ping my database and grab this information? Right? And so from a high level, that's all that's happening. We are making some sort of request. And then the API says, I either already have this, or let me go ping my database and I will grab the information and I can give you back a response. Now, the typical way that we get a response back from an API, and this is just sort of general, there's often multiple ways you can do it depending on your use case. The most common way that we are going to get a response, does anybody know what it's called? What type of, or how is our data formatted to us?
JSON.
Yeah, JSON, right? Does anybody know what JSON stands for?
Jason,
Yeah, JSON. So it's going to be this JSON, and it's usually all caps.
Is
So
it
the-
JavaScript object notation or something like that?
Is JavaScript object notation, right? All that is very fancy for saying it's just an object, right? It is just an object that's what it's going to give us back, right? So it's going to say, hey, you requested the information. We're good. We have it. Here it is. And the way that it's plated the food, right? It's just in a style called JavaScript object notation, also referred to, and you'll always hear it as JSON. So, yeah. Does anybody have any quick questions on an API before I delete this code or this picture? If anybody wants to take a screenshot, sort of now is the time. Does anybody have any questions on an API? Obviously, APIs can be way more granular. There's things you can do. You can kind of host stuff within your code. So that way you're not having to handle certain things and making API calls. But at the end of the day, this is all an API is doing, and they're very, very popular. I usually tell my students, especially if this is your last stack and you're going into projects and algorithms, really having an API do some work for you is a great way to make a project, a capstone, a any sort of project really stand out because it's like, wow, I cannot believe you already have Google Maps integrated into your code. You already have, fill in the blank API. This is really cool and robust, but it's like you didn't really do much. You just kind of called the API and handled what it gave back to you. But does anybody have any questions on this?
Yeah, I have a question. I guess, so when does the backend come into play, or is that here in this diagram?
Yeah, so we've got this request, and then our backend is kind of this idea of this kitchen and this cook. You can think of the
Okay.
server as our middleware, right? As handling, taking this request and sometimes formatting it. We're going to use two tools for that. One called Express, which is the E in MERN, and then another called Mongoose. So it's going to format our request in the way. So let's say that, let's say I go to a restaurant that is of a culture that I don't speak the language. And so I mispronounce how something, what something is called, right? Let's say I go to France and I order some French dish and I totally butcher it because I don't speak French. Maybe the server's going to go back and be like, well, this is like, here's what they want. And then the kitchen's going to say, cool, either I need to go to my database and get that, or I'm going to go, or I already have this information, I can give it to them. Our middleware is kind of that interpreter, if you will, and it makes it a lot easier as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Great question. Anybody else have any sort of questions on this whole idea of an API? From a general stance, you're going to hear the word API, and really that's going to encompass like all of this, right? So if you are hearing like, oh, just ping this API, the way that this idea of abstraction, where you don't have to know what's going on under the hood, you just need to make your request. All of this stuff is what's happening, but you're not going to deal with it because you don't have access to the database, or you don't have access to how Google handles authentication. You don't need to deal with that. You just make your request, and then the API handles everything else. So you might hear that as like a generic, if you hear the word API, which section exactly, it kind of encompasses all of this stuff. It's a way that we can communicate or interact with some other application, right? Because at the end of the day, everything really is just, oftentimes just an API. Any other questions before I delete this guy?
Yeah, I just had a question about kind of APIs in general.
Yeah.
How much would you say they differ? Like this whole like cycle in calling them, like if you like learn how to call and use one API, is it going to differ much between using a different API?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not like a super big standard on how APIs operate. It's really how the company has set up their API to be communicated with. One big thing is basically even what languages can you use? They're not language agnostic. And so sometimes you're handling it in a certain way. Luckily, JavaScript and Python are really popular and really sort of, those are usually taken care of, but I've had interactions with APIs that only support PHP and Ruby. And you're like, LOL, why? That does not make any sense. And so it can differ, and it depends on what you're trying to do. Now, I would say once you get into the habit, because similar to, and why I put read menu, all these APIs, especially the good ones, and we'll get into this in a second, but they have good usability and documentation. And so you will, if you get used to learning how to read the menu, i.e. the documentation for the API and how they want you to set it up, that in itself becomes a skill. And then you say, okay, I'll just format in this specific way, and then I'm good to go. So if you get used to that, they are all different, unfortunately, right? The way they handle things, it's all just as kind of a set of functions. And we're saying, and at the end of the day, we're sort of building one where we're going to say, hey, if you make these requests, when we build our backend, which we haven't gotten to yet, when we build our backend, I want you to make these requests, and it has to be, you have to use this method, and you have to pass in this piece of information. And if you don't do that, I have no idea what you're talking about, and I can't give you the response that you want. If you do that, then I can give you a good response. So same sort of idea. If you're dealing with any sort of API, you kind of just have to get used to reading their documentation and you have to adhere to how they want you to set up certain APIs. Now, one thing to note is that sometimes, and I can show you here in a second, this list of like these free APIs. There's a million APIs. There's an API for everything. There's a jokes API. There's a cats API. There's a dogs API. There's all kinds of APIs. Now, some companies make their money off being an API, right? And the way you might be like, how do they do that? Well, they charge you based off of how many requests you make. And that totally depends on the company. If you want to have 1,000 requests, is $1. If you do 250, it's 25 cents, but then 250 for another one, because maybe it's intensive, or like ChatGPT is a great example. That's an API, but based on which model you're using, if it's the computationally heavy one, it's 6 cents per request. Or if you take the least computational heavy, meaning that it costs them less to run it in the cloud, and it's like 0.002 cents, right? And so does anybody know, how do they know if you are making a request or not? Does anybody kind of have a thought on what they use in order for this to happen? For them to know that you, Cameron, or you, Tabitha, are making this request? Anybody have any ideas? It's what we call an API key. So when you're dealing with APIs, especially in the ones that cost money, right? Or sometimes they'll say, hey, here's your API key, up to 1,000 are free. And then anything past that, you get charged 2 cents or something, right? What they do is they give you this idea of this key. This is your unique identifier, right? You can sort of think about it as like when I was born here in the US, I was given a social security number, right? There might be a ton of Will Calhouns in the US, but there's only one Will Calhoun with my specific social security number, right? Same sort of idea happens with APIs. They can, when you make a request, oftentimes you have to give, hey, here's my authentication. Here's my key card to say, hey, yep, this is me. I have access. I've already gone through it. You guys have my credit card. You have my information. You know who to bill. Here's my API key. And that goes, okay, cool. API has been authenticated. Now you make all your requests and you're good to go. And then we're just going to keep track. And then at the end of the month, they say, hey, you've done 5,000 requests. We said anything over 1,000 is going to cost 2 cents a request. Here's your bill, right? And so an API key is how, and because companies can make a boatload of money off of people just using their code, right? Because you think about it, they don't really, once they build out the framework, they don't really have to do much. They have to make sure that their code's maintained, but people are just pinging and wanting their application to do something for them. Or chat GPTs is like, hey, they already built the model. Now just people are interacting with it. And so they just make a whole bunch of money just doing off this. So because it's such a money maker, the documentation often, especially for good APIs, things like Google or Facebook or Twitter used to have one. And then, Twitter's kind of in its own entity right now. But they make money off of that. And so then they want people to use it. So they try to make it as easy as possible to be used. So cool. Great. Any other questions on APIs? These are great questions. And again, this whole idea is just theory. I want you guys to realize just what an API is from a high level. And then we're going to look at some documentation. We'll make an API request using a tool called Postman. We'll see this response and then we'll go from there. So any other questions? Okay. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to give you guys like 2 seconds. If you want to screenshot this, I'm going to give you 5 seconds actually. And then if you want to screenshot it, please do so now. And if not, whatever. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay. Perfect. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. That is our intro to APIs. We're probably not going to get to this use effect now that I look at it. I want to introduce this tool called Postman. Now, this is a free tool. It is a very common tool. I would highly encourage you, to get used to using this tool. You can find it on the platform, but I think if you just go to, oh man, there's 43 in the chat. I'm so sorry. Let me watching the death of Twitter. Yeah, that's tough, dude. And things are blown up. You know what I mean? Yeah, Stacy, ChatGPT has multiple APIs. Depends on what you want. It is awesome though. API key. Docs. We love that. Wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. Whoa, Paul, are you a Doctor Who person? Whoa, did we just become best friends? It's my favorite show of all time.
Baby.
Oh my gosh, dude, I'm obsessed. Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. Good to know that my microphone was not good. Okay. So Postman is a really popular tool. We're going to use it a lot. So make sure you download it. You can also just go to Postman. Like if you just typed in Postman downloads, it'll just download Postman, get started for free. So it is free. You don't have to. I think there's like a premium version. You literally, I don't even know why anybody would do it. I've never used it, but I've used it on multiple jobs, both as a developer, as all kinds of things. So Postman's a tool that I would really encourage you guys, even just this weekend, just download it, play with it, see how it works, see what it does. It's a really good tool. And what it does is allows us to make a request to an API. But before we do that, let's look up. This is going to be a very common API, especially with like learning stuff. It's called Swappy, which it is the Star Wars API. And so here we can see that there's a couple things within our APIs. And so we'll kind of look at all of this stuff and I'll kind of demystify it for you. So what this does is this specific API gives you data for Star Wars, right? So I can say if I want planets or spaceships or vehicles or people or films or species, all 7 Star Wars films. I don't know if there's more Star Wars films than now. Now with The Force Awakens, I don't know the most recent. I'll be honest, I'm not a Star Wars person. I think it's cool, just don't love it as much as other people do, but I love that for them. But what it does, it allows us to get some information. So here we see this guy right here. This is what we call our base URL, right? This is what kind of everything is going to follow this. And in our platform, we talk about REST APIs. RESTful or REST APIs is really just a way that we can structure our APIs or structure our data. So that way it builds upon itself. What do I mean by that? Well, here, everything is going to start with this base API or this base URL. Sorry. Everything is going to start with https swappy.dev/API. Everything is going to start with that. And so it's a way that we can kind of have some uniformity with how people make requests, right? Not everything is going to be unique, and it allows them, if they want to write a application that's dynamic based off if somebody says people, if they say places, they don't have to rewrite multiple URLs, right? They can have this and then just concatenate whatever they want. Now, next, what you can do is you can try people. And a RESTful API sort of builds upon itself. So if I just say people, let's see what happens, is we get 82 people. And this is our, sorry, I make my request, right? I say swappy.dev/API/people. And that is my request. That is me telling the waiter, I want to get all of your people. That's what I'm ordering. So the waiter is going to come back, server is going to come back and say, cool, I've got 82 of them. Here they all are. Now, the way it works is it is all one big object, right? At the end of the day, it's one big object. Within this, oops, we've got a couple different keys. We've got count, we've got next, we've got previous. We've got this key of results that is a list or an array of objects. if I have got an array of objects, what is my built-in method I can use to iterate through each of them and potentially show them if I wanted? Anybody remember? Talked about it. this
Map.
week. Yeah, exactly. Map, right? And that's what's great about it is, I can't, maybe it was Cameron asked if they're all the same. They're not all the same, but they do oftentimes follow the same sort of format. So if you're dealing with this, you're often going to get an array of objects. And so they will do that. So there is some uniformity, at least in that portion of, because developers write this, so developers know what's the easiest for them to interact. So they try to make it as easy as possible. And again, for an API, usage is what makes them money. So they want to be as useful as possible. So I could build upon this and say, well, okay, I don't want all of them. I just want the first one in there. I want Luke Skywalker. So if I could just say people/1, right? Again, now I'm just building upon this RESTful portion. And then I say, great. Now it gives me just Luke Skywalker and everything associated with Luke Skywalker. This is us making a request. This is what we call, anybody know what type of request? We have not talked about HTTP verbs. So if you don't know, that's very okay. This is a specific type of request. We're not going to talk about it until week 5, but anybody know what kind of request this is?
Get request?
Yeah, exactly. It's a GET request, right? I want to go and get some information. The other ones are post, which is I want to give you information. We're going to get to these again, week 5. And then you've got a couple for editing, like updating, and then you've got a delete, right? But right now we're just getting, I want to get some information. And so here's the result, or what we would call our response. So we're going to do this. We make our request, and then we get a response. Now, this idea of Postman is same sort of thing, right? I can come here. Oops, don't save. Don't save. Cool. Now I'm going to make a new GET request, and we're going to use this a lot. So if this is the first time you're like, oh my gosh, what is happening? GET request. Now I need to enter my request URL. So this is where we are going to go. Whoops, a daisy. We're going to get our base URL. Come here. Now I also wanted people/1, and it's going to send it. Cool. And it gives me this response. There's a couple things it does when it gives me this response with Postman. Here, when we get this is our response code. 200 is okay. That is just a successful request, right? Meaning that we looked at the menu and we ordered something that they have, right? We did not go to a fine dining restaurant and say, can I have a bowl of Reese's Puffs, right? Go to the kitchen and the kitchen's like, I don't have Reese's Puffs. This is a fine dining restaurant, right? This is a Chili's. We don't have Reese's Puffs. Not that I'm saying Chili's is fine dining, but it also slaps. Their chips, not bad. Right? So when we get a 200, that is, yep, you requested the quesadilla. I got the quesadilla. I'm going to give that to you. Same sort of thing. Hey, you did this correctly. We have this. Now, if I said something like people spelled it incorrectly, 404 not found. And it's saying, hey, I don't know what this is. You're calling swappy.dev API people, but I don't know what that means. So you're going to get a 404. And there's other response codes that we'll have and we'll look at once we get to the back end. But just knowing that if you get a 200, that's a good sign saying, yep, this is a successful request. Now I can change this, go to planets, and I also now get a new planet, right? And it gives me this response. It is in JSON. That's the type, right? This is kind of what, this is what your actual response will look like. This is called raw, right? So this is what it'll give back. And so then we can iterate through this or just say, okay, great. Part of your jobs, especially when you're dealing with APIs, is going to be like, okay, well, how does this work, right? This is what you'll get back. And if you were to console log, this is what it looks like. And this is where Postman really comes in handy because then I can just make it pretty. I'm like, oh, okay, I can now understand that within my response object, I've got this key of residence that is also an array of a whole bunch of people who live on this planet, right? Or I've got another key of films that is an array of how many films was this planet in. And so it allows us to kind of view this in a better way than just looking like this, console logging in our console and us being like, I don't know, I'm pretty stressed, right? I can just come to this and it's like much easier. The other nice thing is I don't have to write the code, right? I can just make the response and test the API, make sure I'm getting a good response, and then integrate that into my code, and then everything is running and good to go. So that's what, I mean, that's the whole idea behind APIs, is we make our request. If it's good, if it's okay, it says, yes, we have this. Yes, this is on our menu. Then, then it'll give me back a response. And the way it does that is through JSON. Cool. Now this is just documentation. There's another one that you're going to do, Pokemon API. Poke API, the same sort of thing, right? You've got your base URL and you've got some information here. And you can see what it's going to give back, resources for Ditto. And then you can see view raw JSON. So this is what it's going to look like. This one's at least like spread out and not all just one line. But you can see this is what it's going to look like. This is a RESTful API. Relates just to this big database that allows us to ask for some information. There. So somebody asked, why was it 1? So whenever I went here, that's just because in reading the documentation, that's just getting the first one. So if I have this ID, right, then this one would have the ID of 1 when it comes to planets. So if I said 2, then that's getting me a different one.
So it doesn't start at 0.
I don't think so. Let's check. It depends on how your API gets set up. Yep.
So don't get that confused though, because the array you get back will still have index position 0.
Where? Oh, did you say don't get confused, Paul?
Yeah, well, I was letting them know, like, when you receive an array of these objects, it will still have an index position 0. Even if, like, they're saying the ID of this thing is 1, if you're mapping through an array, it's still going to have index 0.
Yeah, that's a great point. What I want to communicate is this is like an ID, right? And so decouple this idea behind where it's positioned. It's like if I had, let's say, for example, 1's kind of a bad example, but when we are dealing with our database, we're going to get a unique identifier that's going to look like a big string like this, right? And this, think about like a social security number, is what is attached to our user. And so this is really just our unique identifier in this case, because this is supposed to be a ID, an identifier for an API that's like for people that are beginning. They tried to make it easy by saying, hey, it's just 1, right? But in theory, especially when we deal with MongoDB, like, let me see if I can pull up Mongo Compass, which this is next week, but I'll show you kind of what 1 actually looks like. Oops. Okay. So like if I'm looking at, let's see if there's anything in food trucks. You see that this ID or this truck, this is style is American and cheese, description, delicious. Don't worry about it. All this is my unique identifier. This big string. So if I was doing the same thing, but with food trucks, right? So if it was like, food trucks dot API dot whatever /trucks/ and instead of 1, this is what I would pass in to get this specific food truck. So the one just is supposed to represent this unique identifier, but in the real world of what we're going to be utilizing, it's going to be something like this. This is our ID. We'll get to that when we get to Mongo. Cool. So that is APIs. There's a lot of APIs. So if I were to like GitHub API list, which is a great public APIs. So these are all free. Let me grab this for you and give this in chat. And you can see that there's just a million APIs for anything. If you wanted anime, there's APIs. Some of them have API keys or different auth. Some of them do not. So if I wanted to anime facts, come here, it's a RESTful API, same sort of thing. This is what you get back. And you can make a request to it, right? And say, cool, how do I use this? So if I were to just take this, let's say I was just planning on messing around, come here, I'm making a request, and it gives me an application error. It's pretty funny, actually. I've never used this API. Transparently, I don't know what anime, I don't know anything about anime, but let's see. This is be an example of maybe bad documentation. Because now I can't use this. Yeah, I don't know. Service unavailable. So now this is a 503. So it looks like this API that I just randomly picked is currently not online anymore, or right now not online. So let's try this. We'll see if this works, and if not, then I'm just assuming maybe because somebody's paying for this, right? So maybe, yeah, looks like service unavailable. They stopped paying for it. And they're like, nah, I don't want to host this on Heroku anymore because I think Heroku upped their prices, which is just a hosting app like AWS. So this one, no bueno. But there's a whole bunch that you could also go to. Okay, so somebody said in chat, for our backend, when we make our API routes for our databases, wouldn't people be able to grab and put random data into our database? How would you add security so they can't do that? Great question, Zachary, and that's a really important thing, right? Where we want to make sure that people can't just use Postman to create data. And that's true, they can, if we don't have the certain things. Now, one of the main things that we won't necessarily learn, and you don't need it for your exam, but we will learn in week 7, is we're going to learn all about authentication and authorization whenever they log in. And what we'll make sure is that in order for people to write to our database, we'll have to make sure that they're logged in. And the way we'll do that is we'll do something called a web token, JSON web token. That way we can basically say, hey, we know that this is the person that's making the request, i.e. they have validity and they're able to do that. So as long as they have this web token, then they're able to make this request, and it helps prevent somebody from just coming to Postman and spamming our database with bad data. We can also on the back end make sure that even if they are spamming our database, at least the data isn't poor, in the sense of we can put certain things and certain parameters in there to make sure that, you know, they're not just putting a bunch of empty strings or, you know, whatever. It's, you know, we can kind of manipulate that as well. So there's some security stuff that we'll learn, but that's a great question and great idea, because they can through Postman. In theory, if I wanted to do something, I just do post, pass in my information and make a request, which we will do in class without the security piece. But here is where you can come in and say, hey, do you have authorization from, do you have an API key? Do you have base auth? Do you have a bearer token? This is a really common one. Do you have all of this stuff? Or in the header, do you have like your web token and what's its value? So that's how we can protect it via Postman. Great question though. Any other questions? We're just at time. Any other questions on APIs? We're going to get into use effect with APIs and promises on Tuesday, but any questions just on this theory of APIs, how APIs work? Does this make you excited about APIs, or is this kind of a snooze fest today? Cool. Okay, friends. Well, that's all I have for you. I will stop the recording here unless anybody has any quick questions. And if not, I will stop the recording and then I can hang out for just a second to see if you guys need any help. Okie doke. I'll stop the recording.
Oh, you can stop it. Sorry. It was me.